Hello, everyone. Welcome. I believe we are live. I'm seeing people on screen. Thank you for joining us from, it's hard to say where we are. We are all dispersed. Thank you for joining our session here this afternoon. We are thankful for Catalyst 2030 for organizing it. Catalyst 2030 is a new global collective of social entrepreneurs that Ashoka is proud to be a founding partner of, alongside peer organizations like the Skoll Foundation and the Schwab Foundation. And my name is Constanze Frischen. I'm German by background, so I'm trying to hide my accent. It might come across at one point, bear with me. I'm a global leader with Ashoka, the largest network of social entrepreneurs in the world. We, as many of you I think know, identify and support social entrepreneurs in 90 countries, and all of them bring big systemic solutions to societal problems. And we have the pleasure of being joined by two of them today. That's our Ashoka Fellow, George McGraw. Welcome, welcome, George. And
thanks, Constanze.
His colleague, Emma Robbins. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you.
Both stuck or being in LA right now. I myself am dialing in from Washington, DC. And what we want to do here, we are sort of in terms of the technical setup, we are speaking for roughly 30 minutes. Those of you joining via screen have the opportunity to type in questions that we hope to get to during the call. And what we really want to talk about and we want to give the floor to is to George and Emma. They are working with Dig Deep, an NGO that George is the CEO and founder of, and Emma is the director of Dig Deep's Navajo Water Project. Again, thank you both for being here with us. And it's very exciting to be having you because George and Emma's work is important anyhow, but it's even more important in the context of the global pandemic that we are dealing with. It has a particular connection to their work, which is about access to water. So let's get started and dig in. And I want to start with you, George. Perhaps sort of to frame the problem here, one of the most surprising facts that I learned is that more than 2 million people in the US, in this country, do not have access to running water or basic plumbing. And I think 44 million don't have clean water that is safe to drink at home. So how is that possible? Tell us a little bit about how come we are having this problem? Why is that?
Well, I know we're tight on time, but I mean, we can all just take a second and let that sink in. I think more than 2 million people in the richest democracy on earth not having access to running water, it's just sort of unfathomable. And yet here we are. And I think the majority of Americans have no idea this problem exists.
Yeah.
But there is one sort of simple answer to why this is. And I think it's structural racism and the marginalization of poor people in the United States. We have an incredible water and sanitation system in the US, one of the most advanced in the world, that serves people all over this gigantic country. And we built that using what would be today trillions of dollars of public investment that we started with the New Deal in the 1930s. But since the first day we started making those investments, not everybody was included. Some communities were either deliberately or accidentally sidelined. And that leaves us in this position today where there are millions of Americans who struggle every day just to get enough clean water to survive. And many of them are rural communities of color and indigenous communities. If you're indigenous in the US, you're 19 times more likely not to have running water than if you're white. If you're Black or Hispanic, you're twice as likely. And these aren't just isolated individuals living off the grid by themselves. These are entire communities in all 50 states. From the California Central Valley to the Navajo Nation, where my colleague Emma is from, to the US-Mexico border region, the Deep South, Appalachia, Puerto Rico. And we've done a lot of work at Dig Deep trying to understand the scope of this problem. And just last year in the fall, published the first national report on water and sanitation access called Closing the Water Access Gap in the US. And to get all the depressing stuff out, hopefully right at the beginning nationally, I think the one thing that Americans should really be nervous about or be scared of when it comes to this problem isn't just that it affects so many, but that in so many parts of the country, that number is growing for the first time in our national history. So in 6 states and in Puerto Rico, fewer people next year will have access to running water than they have it this year. And I think that's completely unacceptable.
It's completely unacceptable. And it's probably also hard for many of us to imagine just what it means to be, what it really means to be living without access to clean drinking water. So Emma, I would like to turn to you here. You are a Dine artist and a social justice fighter. You work with the community on Navajo Nation to secure access to safe drinking water. I read in your bio that you grew up with your grandparents having no access to water or electricity. So tell us a little bit, I'm interested in two things, both sort of the historic roots and then also what that what does it mean? What is it like?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that intro. So I am Emma Robbins, and I do want to clear it up that during the week I did live with my parents, and then on the weekends I lived with my grandparents. So I think that's important to mention, not only because I don't want to advertise falsely, but also to really show that I grew up with the duality of that, right?
Yeah.
Understanding what it is like to have that luxury and what it is not like. It's tough. I mean, I will say that Natives and Navajos are very resilient, and we are able to work on these problems and solve them, as we see with the Navajo Water Project, but it's a total injustice, as George said. It's not something that is advertised often. Now with this global pandemic, we're starting to see it talked about a lot more, but it really shouldn't take a pandemic for people to notice that. But when you can't wash your hands or you can't have safe, clean drinking water, it affects everything, and more than ever now.
Yeah. And I'm assuming it is both like a cause of poverty, and it's like a vicious circle, right? Because it affects how much time you have, how quickly you can dress up, and all these things, right?
That's really important to mention, the circle of poverty, because when you're having to drive long distances, which not only does my family and community do, but also everyone we work with in terms of installing water systems, you're spending a lot of gas money. You're putting wear and tear on your truck. If you're hauling water, you're putting these huge tanks in the back of it. You're taking time off from work or away from caring for your family. And exactly what you said, it contributes to this big circle.
Yeah.
And I'll say that, just to make that real for people, because I think that's one of our fundamental problems that we're running into as an organization, is that even when we say those numbers, most Americans just have no mental vocabulary for what that really looks like. They haven't, experienced it the way Emma has. They haven't witnessed it the way I have. But I think one of the first times I ever visited the Navajo Nation, where Emma's from, which is a sovereign indigenous nation, it's the biggest reservation in the US. Where about 1 in 3 Navajo don't have access to running water or electricity at home. The first time I visited, I was on a water truck with a Dene woman named Darlene, who was delivering water to her neighbors. And out of the very first house came this woman named Brenda with a big pot, and she filled it directly from the truck and ran back into the kitchen. And I followed her, and she was making tamales. And her husband, who was the sole breadwinner in their house, he had hurt his foot at work, couldn't wash it properly at home, and was infected with gangrene and had to be hospitalized at IHS in Gallup, about 40 miles from their home. And he had been discharged from the hospital 10 days before I got there with water, but had been sleeping on the streets of Gallup because his wife didn't have the water she needed to make tamales, to walk down into town to sell in order to get the gas money to drive to Gallup to pick up her husband so he could come back and work. And that's how that poverty cycle works. Water is so fundamental to everything: our health, our ability to have an education, our ability to keep our jobs. And we take it so for granted as Americans, but there are these Americans among us, many of whom are actually our neighbors in our same states and counties, who can't take it for granted because they struggle every day just to get enough to survive.
Yeah. And it's not like it's a question of personal achievement, right? I didn't have to do the plumbing in my house. It was just there for me. So I want to go back to you, Emma, and so tell us a little bit more about the historic roots here that have led to the situation.
Yeah, I mean, like George said, I know we have 30 minutes, and that could take me like 30 years to talk about for sure. But you know, it's a mix of things, right? Like being on a sovereign nation that is so large, it makes it very difficult to have infrastructure there in terms of making sure that everybody has water who is spread out. And there's a reason why we're spread out, right? So when treaties were signed and Navajos were forced on the long walk, or huelde, as we call it in Navajo, you know, we were spread out afterwards. And so that makes it a lot harder to service people. Treaties have been broken time and time again, where the federal government or state governments have said, we're going to install these systems, and it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
In addition to that, on the Navajo Nation, there is a lot of uranium and arsenic contamination. And so often people aren't able to access safe water sources there. It's something where sometimes people don't even have money to pay their water bills. And so oftentimes pipes might not even be installed because of that, right? You know, people are assuming automatically that you can't pay for a service. I think one thing as well that we often forget is many Native nations, and I speak specifically about the Diné because I'm from the Navajo Nation, obviously, we live traditionally still. And so oftentimes that includes living out in these further areas. And so it is a weird balance, because it's like you want to continue to live traditionally in the 21st century, but if you want to get things like running water or electricity, oftentimes you're forced into larger communities. And that's something that shouldn't happen, you know.
Yeah.
And I think there's also just not enough push with the government to say, hey, this is something that we have to do. And that's not unique to the Navajo Nation.
Yeah.
A lot of Americans that George is talking about in terms of our backyards, you know, here in Compton, I'm in mid-city LA, just 3 miles away, the city government wasn't doing enough to help. And, you know, there is room for change, but we really have to hold people accountable, and especially on Native nations.
Yeah. Thank you, Emma. So let's talk a little bit about your work and your approach, what Dig Deep is focusing on. I want to come back to COVID in a second, but let's perhaps paint the picture of what your general work is, and especially the work where you're working directly with communities to access water. You call these water projects. Tell us a little bit, George, how these work.
Yeah, so we do policy and education work. We're really interested in setting up an ecosystem to solve this problem. In the rest of the world, in most low and middle income countries that still have water access challenges like this, there's a whole sector called the WASH sector, water, sanitation, and hygiene, that sort of comes together, and it's nonprofits like ours, grassroots organizations, communities themselves, with a whole ecosystem of dedicated funders and government agencies that sets goals and builds water projects. We're the first global WASH funder to focus on solving this problem in the US, and we're trying to build that same ecosystem, that same community here. And one of the ways that this work has been so successful abroad, in literally cutting in half over the last couple of decades the amount of people globally without access to water, has been that they focused one project at a time on empowering communities to serve themselves, communities who have been completely left behind in decision-making processes around their own infrastructure. And so we do the same thing. We partner with communities like Emma's, and share the load and imagine what it takes to get hot and cold running water into people's homes, and often sanitation like flush toilets. And we build projects that are specific to each of these areas, whether it's rural Texas or Appalachia or the Navajo Nation, that can really be owned and operated and managed by the people they serve. And I'll let Emma talk about the specifics of the Navajo Water Project and how that works. It's been really beautiful to see it come together.
Emma.
Thanks, George. So I think it's really important to mention that obviously every project is unique, right? Like the areas that George mentioned, there's not going to be a copy and paste solution from the Navajo Nation. But what works for us with the Navajo Water Project is we are installing off-grid cistern systems. And to just give you a brief breakdown, the way that that works is there is an underground cistern, which is 1,200 gallons, a series of plumbing, a pump that brings in the water, a heater, because it's very important to Dig Deep and to the Navajo Water Project that not only people have running water, but they have hot running water, because that's super important. And then we have a filter and a sink there. And the 1,200 gallon cistern is filled up by a water truck that gets potable water, or water that's okay to drink from a safe source. I see that someone is on this call who has helped us obtain one of those trucks, and I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. because that's a really important element of getting water out to people, you know, who are further out. So far, we've installed almost 300 of these systems. And so that's serving thousands of people and making sure that they are having clean water. And actually, one of the questions I get a lot is, you know, do you need electricity to make these systems work? Yes, you need electricity because we need something to power the pump. So with that said, there's another element. There are two types of systems, and one of the systems we install solar power in. So that way there's a pump that is powered by that electricity, but also we add in lights, which is important too. If you're in front of a sink, you're gonna wanna be able to see your hands when you're washing them.
Yeah.
But the second thing that I also wanna plug here is we are also starting a septic pilot program. And what that looks like is 5 families will receive indoor toilets and septic systems, which is really important because having running water goes hand in hand with having a safe place to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, yeah. And Emma, sort of nowadays, sort of coming back to the current pandemic, you know, we all hear it's imperative, you wash your hands up to 50 times a day. So that must, you know, feel come across in a particular way for your clients, right? For your communities. And so I want to hear a little bit more about that, and also how you guys had to pivot or did pivot now with COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been easy, but it's something that we've been very successful at. I want to give a shout out to the Navajo Water Project team who have been working day and night to make sure that we're still getting people water during this pandemic. And so one of the ways that we're able to do it is we are still using the water trucks to fill up these systems. So 300 families are still able to have running water in their homes. We're not stopping from there. And we are now delivering bottled water to communities that we haven't worked in. And that's been interesting because we're able to branch out now from the main communities where we have been servicing our clients. And we have partnered with Nestle, who have contributed almost 250,000 gallons of water, which is what is needed right now. Because during the pandemic, when you don't have running water, you don't have a safe way to wash your hands up to 50 times. I'll say, look at my hands, they're so dry, because I am fortunate to have running water in my home here in California. But when you don't have that, you're not curbing that, you know, you're not stopping the curve. And that's a huge issue. When you don't have running water in your home, you're having to travel miles to stores. As I mentioned, people live in very rural areas. And oftentimes you get to these stores and you see that there are limits that say you can only buy 2 gallons. And, you know, if you have a family of 5, 2 gallons isn't enough. On top of it, oftentimes people get to stores and there isn't even any water left, right? And washing your hands for 20 seconds, that's not just like a cup of water. You're using gallons and gallons and gallons. And, you know, when people do travel to stores, unfortunately, oftentimes they're being exposed to many other people and surfaces and things that they wouldn't have come in contact with if they didn't have to leave their homes. And I'll also add the third element of this is when you are seeing constantly on social media and the news, wash your hands, like you said, up to 50 times, 20 seconds, all of a sudden you feel scared and you feel vulnerable. And that really impacts your mental health because you're being told the 2 ways to protect yourself, wash your hands and stay at home, you're not able to do. And it can really affect you on so many levels.
Yeah, yeah. George, how have your funders, how has your community reacted to the pivoting?
Really positively. I mean, I think Emma even sold herself a little short, maybe because she's been in charge of this entire effort. But I mean, 250,000 gallons of bottled water, half of which has already been distributed.
Like
that's 2 million pounds,
right,
or about 54 semi trucks packed to the brim with bottled water. And that water has served so far about 30,000 people. And so Emma's team pivoted with the support of the Navajo Nation government, the Office of the President and Vice President, a bunch of our local partners, chapter governments, which are like local towns, and then this gigantic network of health officials and local volunteers, mutual aid groups, and other nonprofits that have made this possible. Because, like Emma said, these people are vulnerable for a lot of reasons, and we've heard this in the news. Like on Navajo, there are more. Poverty is an extreme knot of all of these unfortunate things, and there are more pre-existing conditions, and there is more vulnerability. So in order to get that water to that people, it's not enough just to truck it to the nation and leave it there. You have to drive it the last mile to the porch and do a no contact drop off for these elderly folks or people with chronic illness or people who have COVID and need to quarantine. And so we've been working with hundreds of volunteers across 3 states to do that work, and it's been tremendously successful. And our funders and partners have shown up in a big way. Almost all of our work is grassroots funded, and we've had our most successful quarter of grassroots fundraising to date. Literally thousands of people from all across the country and other countries. I saw some Swedish donors come through for us the other day, giving $5, $10, $50, $500, $1,000 to empower Emma's team to do that work and to make this possible. And a lot of our bigger structural funders, Emma mentioned the sanitation pilot that we're launching this year with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which is so exciting. A lot of those bigger structural funders have come to us and said, you know, what do you need? And, you know, can we get you your funding faster?
Yeah. What do you need?
And they've been incredible. What do we need? Well, we're trying to build this network in the US, trying to build a WASH ecosystem. We need partners. We need the funders and organizations that are specifically invested in water and sanitation outcomes abroad to look at the United States and to make meaningful investments here and to reach out to us to coordinate those efforts. We also are still in desperate need of water to distribute on Navajo. And I don't mean like, you know, go home and grab the bottled water out of your fridge and mail it to us. But the Navajo Nation is still a couple months behind major cities like New York and Los Angeles in terms of infection rates. Today, infections top 1,760 deaths, which makes the Navajo Nation the place with the dubious honor of being 3rd in the country behind New York and New Jersey in terms of infections per capita. More than 1% of the entire Navajo Nation's population is infected currently, which is completely unacceptable. And we need to be able to continue to resource these folks as they get through the worst of COVID, which is to come. And a lot of that looks like water. So connections to major corporations that are distributing water so they can reroute those to us and let us, you know, pour those donations out through our networks. We're also in need of engineering support from time to time on our water projects. So people with professional engineering degrees, especially in hydrology or geology, are especially helpful for us. And finally, some of our best champions are teachers. I know some people on this call are educators, and not just because they can take this and put it in front of children, young people, college students, grad students, and help us be the generation that ends this for once and for all in the United States. But also because those classrooms become such engines of change themselves, spreading the message to their friends and families, raising funds. So I always encourage teachers, whatever your discipline, to work this somehow into your curriculum and to work with us on that.
Thank you, George. And it leads to sort of a big part of your work. We talked about the Community Water Project. The big other pillar of your work is on education and advocacy. And I read on your website or in your report that Americans that do have running water at home use nearly 100 gallons a day, more than any other country on earth. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we use double what someone in Germany uses. We use, you know, 1/3 more than what someone in Canada uses. It's wild.
Yeah. So sort of where are your points where you go in for your education and advocacy work? You mentioned teachers already, but are there, I'm assuming that's not all.
People are always asking what you can, you know, what can we do to support Dig Deep? And the answer is always, first and foremost, and will continue to be money. Like what we're facing is an economic imbalance. These communities have been deliberately sidelined and left out of the capitalist system that has served some people in this country. And so if you can make a donation to digdeep.org or the NavajoWaterProject.org, it's the best way to start. But Constanza, you and I both have kids at home. And I think even if you can give money, this sort of education always begins with personal experience. Everyone that works in human rights knows that this whole system that we've built ever since the end of World War II, the human rights system, is based primarily in an experience of empathy, an understanding that there is something that binds us together, some common destiny. And we try to build empathy by doing something we call the 4 Leaders Challenge. And this is especially fun for kids, but kids of all ages. Basically, I mean, Emma had
question. It's actually one of the questions here in my chat. What is the 4 Leaders Challenge?
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. So Emma lived this with her grandparents on the weekend. But as you noted, most Americans use 100 gallons or about 400 liters of water per person per day, when our clients on Navajo on average make a gallon per person per day stretch, which is about 4 liters. And so what we encourage people to do is take a 1 gallon milk jug that's empty, or take a 1 liter water bottle and fill it 4 times through the day. And every time you have to use water for a 24-hour period, use it from that milk jug or use it from that liter. Like, pour it onto your toothbrush, pour it into your ramen, like pour it onto the stain in your clothes, use it to wash your armpits. And by the way, you have to drink 2 or 3 liters of it just to stay alive. So spending that one day, 24 hours, it might sound trite, but is actually a really powerful experience of solidarity with the Americans around us who are struggling this way every day. And it will completely, in 24 hours, change the way you think about water in your own home and in your own life. So I really encourage everyone to try that.
Thank you, George. This is a very doable and great idea. I'm coming to another question here in the chat. That is, a big idea of yours seems to be the locally owned, controlled systems. As big systems around the US fail, like Flint, for instance, is this a glimpse into the future for more of us?
I'll let Emma talk about the power of local ownership and control.
Yeah.
That's the only way that these projects will continue to thrive, right? Is when we work with communities to design solutions, and when we work with communities to say, how are we going to make sure that this is going to be sustainable after we leave, which we never really do. We meaning Navajo Water Project or Dig Deep. Because you know, what we see a lot is people come in, and I mentioned the copy and paste solution. A lot of times organizations or individuals will come in and say, this worked in a developing country, so this is going to work here on the reservation. And Native nations are very complex, right? And so obviously community and community government is a huge and central part of our culture. And especially on the Navajo reservation, it's important to go to communities that are unique, these individual little universes, as I always think of them, and say, okay, let's make this happen together, and let's make sure that this is going to continue for decades on end. It's definitely something that can be challenging, because when you're not of the community, it takes a while to build those relationships, which is a huge part of my job.
I can speak for that.
Yeah. A lot of times people will say, well, you're Navajo, so you must be cool with working across the Navajo Nation. But like, you know, I'm from the Western Agency, and where I work is on the Eastern side. And we even have like different words in Navajo, you know, it's funny because we're just so different culturally. So a huge part of even getting to that point of sustainability and collaboration is building these relationships. And it can take years, but it's worth it.
And really, really interesting. Here's another question. So I have 2 more. So one is the importance of government funding, both for you, both nationally and state-wise and federally. And then another question: do you think the pandemic will help break down the boundaries and view water access problems more holistically?
I'll take one, and Emma will take 2, if that's okay, Emma.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think, listen, human rights generally are, you know, govern the relationship between a citizen and his, her, or their government. The fact that there are people in the US who live without the basics like water and sanitation means our government has failed. And our government has the primary responsibility of correcting that failure. But as we've all seen, government isn't the best at noticing or correcting its own failures until it's brought to task. And in the meantime, we can't just let people die or suffer or live without dignity. And so I would love it one day if Dig Deep didn't exist, because the US did what it did before, which is have federal agencies tasked with solving this problem. I mean, You know, back in the 60s, we had agencies just in charge of building water systems to serve rural communities of 1,000 people or less. All of that went away in the late 70s. And now government spending is only 9% of what it was for water and sanitation infrastructure in 1977. And most of that is in loans and not grants that these communities will never be able to access or afford to pay back. So yes, I think government has to take the lead here. And there have been some, I think, you know, not to brag, but I think because of our work and the work of Emma and her colleagues to get this problem in front of the American public and legislators, there's more of an appetite for that work. But even in the proposed legislation we're seeing in the stimulus bill and with the new American Water Infrastructure Act, it's a drop in the bucket, so to speak. It's not nearly enough. And we need to come together as a country to close the water access gap, and doing so makes economic sense. It'll create, you know, $220 billion in economic growth and probably 15 million jobs, which God knows we need now more than ever.
Thank you, George. Emma, you have the last question. Will it break down the boundaries, the pandemic, and will that lead to us viewing water access problems more holistically?
Yeah, and I also actually just want to tack something on to what George said there, is that one way that we really need to change the way that we think about this, and the US as well, that was mentioned in the water study, the hotspot water poverty study that Dig Deep and the US Water Alliance did, is that we need to start defining this as a crisis, because it is a crisis to not have running water. It's not something where it's like, oh, let's fix this and come up with a solution. It is a health crisis. And I will plug the water study here, which is closethewatergap.org, to learn more about not only the Navajo Nation, but the other communities as well. In terms of people being more concerned now, it is ridiculous that it has taken a pandemic for people to understand the severity of this. However, I am here and I am ready to ride with that, because when you have the public's attention and CNN and People Mag and all these different larger news outlets are reporting on it, we have to take that and continue to ride with it. It's horrible what's going on right now, but I think we really need to act while we have people's attention and say, this is an issue. This is not something that only happens during the pandemic. It's not only during the pandemic that people can't wash their hands. It's something that happens 365, 24/7, every single second of the day. And once we start to factor in that this is going to continue after the pandemic, we really just need to keep reminding people, whether that is anybody on this call, our sisters and brothers, you know, allies, everything, the government, we need to just keep pushing and say, this is not over. Just because the pandemic is over doesn't mean that it doesn't matter anymore that people don't have water.
Thank you so much for both of you and for being so eloquent about the situation, and also explaining how we can turn the current crisis into an opportunity, but also making clear that we need to be vigilant. This is not being solved by just giving out more bottled water over the next 4 weeks. This is a long-term infrastructural challenge that we need to tackle. Thank you so much for joining us. Do write to us if you want to know more about Dig Deep, and all stay safe and healthy, please. Thank you. And we are a little bit over time. So thanks again for joining. Have a great day. Stay healthy, all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.